Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. So we're getting towards the end of July, and one of the BookTube events for July is PrivateEyeJuly, where we read books about private investigators. The PrivateEyeJuly event is hosted by Mystery and Mayhem, Alan Reed's, Book Time with Elvis, Bookish Travels, Ghost Readers in the Sky, Infinite Text, Michael K.Vaughan, Obscure Book Adventures, Roy Reads Everything, and of course Steve Donoghue. The rule with Private Eyes is that they have to accept payment for their job and that they are not employed by any kind of police organisation, although they can be sort of associated occasionally with them. Back in June I read a couple of Private Eye books, but they were fantasy, and I've read at least another fantasy Private Eye book, and I thought, well, why don't I put together a little reading list of fantasy and science fiction Private Eye books? That might work. So, 6 of each. Fantasy and science fiction, private investigators on the case. We start with Sweet Silver Blues by Glen from 1987. This is the first book of a 14-novel run about a private eye called Garrett in a fantasy city. Glen is a fantasy writer who I keep hearing about, but keep thinking he's another Glen of whom I don't approve. And I can't remember who that is offhand. But he does seem to be a very prolific writer and a very well-respected writer. In Sweet Silver Blues, our hero Garrett is employed to find the heir of a large fortune that has been gathered by an old military comrade. The first part of the book is spent doing some actual private eye work, doing some investigation, with Garrett going around the city, getting in touch with contacts, renewing friendships, renewing enmities as well. And then about halfway through the book, we sort of get a fellowship together and they go off on a fairly standard fantasy adventure. And while that works very well, it doesn't feel any longer as if we're dealing with a private investigator. But all in all, this is a very entertaining piece of work and a good read. And there is a slight temptation to continue with the other 13 books in the series. The next book is Thraxas by Martin Scott from 1999. Martin Scott is actually the pseudonym of a writer called Martin Miller. I first came across Martin Miller when he co-adapted Jane Austen's Emma for the stage with the actress Doone McKeekan. I watched that adaptation and really enjoyed it and started to read Martin Miller as a result. Martin Miller is a Scottish writer living in London who writes sort of countercultural books. Some people describe it as punk. And his writing does seem to concentrate on things that are outside mainstream society. His book Thraxas, published under the name Martin Scott, was a little bit of a departure for him and a little bit of an experiment. It did turn out quite successfully because Thraxas won the World Fantasy Award in 2000. Thraxas is a private investigator in a Middle-earth type city called Turai. He lives and works above a tavern and likes his beer and his food and is built accordingly. He's been a soldier, he's been the head of security at a palace, and he's also done a little bit of magic, although not an awful lot. He can look after himself in a fight. He is aided by Macri, a half-orc young woman who has spent most of her life in the orcish gladiator pits, and is now a slightly skimpily clad barmaid in the tavern below. She's an exceptionally good fighter, not just with the double sword blades, but also fighting for women's rights in the city of Turai, which of course is sort of medieval and misogynist. But she doesn't really understand what it is to be human, having not been brought up as one. And she does have occasionally have some difficulties with sort of human emotions. The relationship between Thraxas and Macri is not romantic, and if you said it was father-daughter, they would probably run screaming from the room. But that's kind of the closeness. Macri is oddly very dependent on Thraxas's good opinion of her, and Thraxas is something of a blowhard. He's very conceited and always bigs himself up, and somebody sometimes denigrates Macri, and he always has to apologise, and she bursts into tears, and that's kind of how each book ends. And there's a certain amount of formula to the books, but they are all very entertaining. There have been 12 in total. They are easy reads. You can easily read one in an afternoon, and I find them extremely entertaining. It is perhaps slight special pleading on my part, but I do think these books should be in the conversation when it comes to fantasy books in general, and fantasy books involving private eyes in particular. The next book is a biggie, Stormfront, by Jim Butcher from 2000. It's a biggie because it is the first of the Dresden Files. Harry Dresden, a magician, private eye, who lives in Chicago and deals with all the supernatural creatures. These books pioneered the urban fantasy genre and are certainly amongst the best. I do have some qualms about urban fantasy in general because it tends towards the bloody, tends towards the horror, and I'm not a massive fan of horror, but these are very readable books. Harry Dresden is an interesting and entertaining person to be around, even if everybody else is getting slaughtered in horrible ways around him. They did make a television series based on the Dresden Files. It is actually quite entertaining. It's made in about 2009. My only complaint about it, perhaps, is that although I've only read 2 of the 17 Harry Dresden novels, I do feel that they suit their length. They suit a sort of a good novel-sized length, and just 50 minutes or 45 minutes if you're including adverts, it doesn't really do them justice. Although the Harry Dresden books are full of sort of visceral and bloody scenes, there is some comic relief provided by Harry Dresden's assistant, Bob, a ghost who lives in a skull on a shelf in Harry Dresden's den. The next book is Something from the Nightside by Simon R. Green from 2003. This book features John Taylor, who is tempted back into the Nightside after 5 years of self-imposed exile. The Nightside is a fantasy underworld of contemporary London. People often credit Simon R. Green with creating this idea, although Neil Gaiman might have something to say about that, but of course we're not talking about Neil Gaiman anymore, are we? The Nightside is a place where all your fantasies, especially your dark ones, can be realised, and where people go for refuge from a world that is too normal. John Taylor is, in fact, somebody of quite some importance on the Nightside. He has many important enemies and some powerful friends. And in this book, we discover that it is possible that he might bring about the end of the world. And with my usual caveats about urban fantasy, John Taylor is quite an interesting person to read about, and the books are entertaining and have a layer of black humour to them. There are 12 books in the series, so it might be worth continuing with it. We stay with urban fantasy in contemporary London for our next book, The Devil You Know by Mike Carey from 2006. This is the first of his 6 Felix Castor novels. Felix Castor is a freelance exorcist. He spends much of his time ridding places of ghosts, but occasionally comes up against more demonic forces. In Felix Castor's world, the ghosts are often angry and disturbed. They lived miserable lives and possibly met violent ends. I did read this book some years ago, and I had to be reminded of it in order to make this video. And rereading it a bit makes me want to read more of Felix Castor's adventures. I think I'd sort of let go of him too much before, especially because, as I say, urban fantasy for me often equates to horror, and I'm not really a horror person. Our next book is Sword Edge Blonde by Alex Bledsoe from 2007. This is the first of 5 books featuring Eddie Lacrosse, who calls himself a sword jockey, which is kind of the equivalent of a private eye in his fantasy world. After a somewhat red herring introduction, Eddie Lacrosse is persuaded to return to the place of his birth, where he is a nobleman in a kingdom and a friend of the king. The kingdom is in turmoil because the queen appears to have murdered her son, and Eddie Lacrosse gets embroiled in an investigation that touches on his past as much as anything else. To begin with, I wasn't really enjoying this book. I'm a big fan of Alex Bledsoe's Toofer stories, but this didn't quite work to start off with. But by sort of halfway through, I was really enjoying it, and it really sort of hit the mark. We move on to science fiction and Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency by Douglas Adams from 1987. This is the first of regrettably only 2 Dirk Gently novels by Douglas Adams. Yeah, he was planning to do more at the time of his death. Dirk Gently is a detective who investigates the interconnectedness of all things, but does spend quite a lot of his time trying to expense trips to the Bahamas in order to look for old ladies' cats. A couple of the elements from the Dirk Gently books come from the time when Douglas Adams was script editor for Doctor Who in the late 70s. That was actually his last salaried job. In the 1979 Doctor Who story City of Death, which up until I think the second or third David Tennant Christmas episode was the most watched ever Doctor Who story, there is an alien who is trying to go back in time to fix a mistake that caused the deaths of the crewmates of his spaceship. Another story that is based on is Sharda, which was not actually broadcast because a strike stopped it from being completed. In Sharda, we have Professor Urban Chronotis, who is a don at the University of Cambridge, and his Cambridge rooms just happen to be a time machine. And although you can make a strong argument that Douglas Adams moved beyond just Doctor Who with these Dirk Gently stories, a lot of people automatically related them back to Doctor Who. These days it doesn't feel quite so pronounced as in the late 80s and early 90s. But all the same, Doctor Who connection might be the reason that it's never translated successfully to television. There was a British attempt starring Stephen Mangan and Darren Boyd to make a television series about Dirk Gently, but it really didn't work. I think for a number of reasons. Basically, they turned it into a series where some technology could work, like genetic engineering and even time travel, but there were to be no aliens and no fantastical elements like ghosts or gods, which, rather spoiled things.
There was a slightly more successful television series which ran for 2 seasons, made in America some years later. This featured Samuel Barnett as a character called Dirk Gently, who believed in the interconnectedness of all things and was able to detect accordingly. But it really was sort of Dirk Gently in name only, and a kind of a riff on the ideas of Dirk Gently. But it was certainly a pretty good series to watch all the same. The next book is Gun with Occasional Music by Jonathan Lethem from 1994. This book won the Locus Award for Best First Novel, and it was indeed Jonathan Lethem's first novel. We're in a noirish world where the guns make music, and they have genetically engineered creatures to be like humans. So you get uplifted cats, you get uplifted kangaroos, and you get babies who have been uplifted into adults but still maintain their baby heads and their baby behaviours. Everybody also has a kind of karma score, and if your score goes down to 0, you get put into a deep freeze, and your body may be used by somebody else for nefarious purposes. I've read some Jonathan Lethem before, and he's a pretty good writer, and I have enjoyed his other books. The only problem I have with this book was a slight feeling that he didn't really care about his subject. It's sort of a conceit, a sort of him going, yes, well, see, I can do science fiction. Look how clever I am. Look at my kangaroo humans, my people with baby heads. Isn't that rather smart of me? And for me, it didn't really feel that he liked what he was doing. He's sort of putting it together because he can, not because he wants to. And this, oddly, is the only singleton in this list. Pretty much everything else has at least one sequel. Our next book might break the rules on Private Eyes, although as seen as the first book in a series, it doesn't, because I don't think the rest of the series does. It is A Disappeared by Kristine Kathryn Rusch from 2002. It is the first of 15 books about a retrieval artist called Miles Flint. We're living in the far future where the Earth is in alliance with some fairly fearsome alien races. And it is implied that these races don't quite have the concepts of justice and mercy that Earthlings do. And that sometimes people from Earth get caught up committing crimes inadvertently or being blamed for something which was actually somebody else's fault. And there are people on Earth who help these possible criminals to escape alien justice and escape being extradited to strange alien worlds. The first book has Miles Flint, who is a detective on the sort of Moon's Space Force, and he is investigating some ships that have come in out of quarantine and are being claimed by various alien races because they have prisoners aboard, or people who should be prisoners of those alien races. It is really a portrait of how he decides to leave the police force and go it alone and help these people escape from somewhat arbitrary justice by the aliens. Although this book is entertaining and well written, there is a slightly off-key note, something that doesn't really taste good, leaves a bad aftertaste in the mouth. The USA is somewhat notorious for not allowing its citizens to be extradited to other countries, even other countries that have fairly just and fair justice systems. There have been high-profile cases where maybe somebody has knocked down an English cyclist and then declared that they have diplomatic immunity and should not face British justice. So I do have a degree of trepidation about books that go, you can't trust these aliens to do justice properly, because it's exactly what the Americans say about the rest of the world and Americans facing justice in other countries. That said, there are intimations in this book that Kristine Kathryn Rusch actually understands all of that. The justice that is expected by the alien races is not necessarily as bad as people think it is, although in some cases it can be. And I wouldn't be surprised if later books do sort of touch on the idea that some people should face justice, even if it is fearsome and alien. The next book is The Time Machine Did It by John Swartzwelder from 2004. There's not an awful lot of information about John Swartzwelder other than he is or was a writer for The Simpsons and wrote 59 episodes. That, I think, equates to about 80% of all Simpsons episodes, which is really quite a lot for just one person. This is the first of a series of 10 books. That seems to have an audience, despite not really being marketed by anybody, apparently. Our detective is a well-pillowed dumb klutz called Frank Burley. He spends a lot of his time being beaten up and not understanding what's going on. A lot of people have seen Homer Simpson in Frank Burley, and I can see why they'd say that. I'm not sure that entirely worked in this first book in the series. Frank Burley spends a lot of his time just being dumb and not really understanding what's going on and then having to have things repeated to him. And then occasionally, when the story permits it, he suddenly puts on a little bit of smarts and actually gets things done and kind of understands the consequences of what he's going to do. As you might expect from a comedy writer, there are an awful lot of jokes in there, and although the jokes are always funny, there is that slight feeling of, oh right, here's a setup for a joke, and here's another setup for a joke. And sure, the jokes are good, the writing's funny, but, part of me wants a little bit more detective work, a little bit more consistency in the way that the detective goes. Now, given that there are 10 books, hopefully they become more consistent over time. This is sort of a first attempt. I'm making this video in the week that the new Fantastic Four movie has come out. And I mentioned that because the movie is set in a sort of retro-futurist 1960s. And this next book, Made to Kill, by Adam Christopher from 2015, is also set in a retro-futuristic 1965. Kennedy is still alive, as is the last of the robots. In the 1950s, a lot of humanoid robots were built, and then they all went wrong, and almost all of them were destroyed, except the last one, who is called Ray Electromatic. He has set himself up as a private investigator, helped by his assistant Ada, who is basically a room full of computers, but sometimes seems suspiciously like a very human secretary. This is the first of 3 books by Adam Christopher featuring his detective Ray Electromatic. Adam Christopher has written that he was very inspired by the work of Raymond Chandler, and it creates his vision of a slightly changed LA from that. This book features Hollywood actors who appear to have been taken over by sinister Soviet forces. And Ray has to find out how the Soviet Union might be using them to take over the world. The title, Made to Kill, comes from the fact that Ray Electromatic records all his daily memories on a spool of tape, and it only lasts one day, after which he forgets everything. It also means that he can be made to forget things that he does, and it does look as if his assistant, Ada, has been hiring him out as a hitman. I've read one other Adam Christopher book, The Empire State, and I seem to remember enjoying it, but I can't remember much about it, and I think I might have to go back and give it a reread, certainly on the basis of these stories. They have a lightness of touch and a comic sense to them, although I did find the portrayal of LA and the 1965 Hollywood somewhat shallow. Not unrealistic, but just a little bit shallow. This is possibly because I've read James Ellroy's highly detailed LA trilogy and other LA stories that he writes, which feature an awful lot of the darker side of Hollywood. And you kind of expect that now from almost any book. Our last book is Titanium Noir by Nick Harkaway from 2023. In this, our detective is something of a consultant for the police, when the police have to deal with the Titans. In this future world, the Titans are people who have had a treatment that has cured all their diseases, fixed their broken bodies, and given them an extended lifespan, almost to immortality. It has also meant that they are somewhat bigger than normal humans. If you were 6 foot before the treatment, afterwards you'd be more like 7 foot high. These Titans have to be very rich in order to afford the treatments, and they become these freakishly large people, these people who live almost like gods, especially the people who have had multiple treatments and may reach over 10 foot high and are built as just as bulkily as normal humans. Nick Harkaway is a pseudonym for Nicholas Cornwall, and he is the son of David Cornwall, who published as John le Carre. In fact, Nick Harkaway published Carla's Game recently, which is an interstitial novel about George Smiley and his nemesis from the KGB, codenamed Carla. I recently read his book, Nick Harkaway's book, Gone Away World, which was a rather interesting piece of science fiction. It escaped a lot of the tropes that we normally find in science fiction. I believe there is a second book in the Titanium Noir universe being written at this time, or about to be published. And it's, again, a very interesting science fiction take on the world, and also a very good detective novel in itself. So, some science fiction and fantasy books based on private investigators, private eyes. I'm sure I've missed out on an awful lot of them, and you probably can suggest an awful lot more. It'd be certainly interesting to read more of all of these series that I've started on, and possibly discover more series to look into. And I wouldn't be surprised if people are screaming Richard Morgan and Altered Carbon and Takeshi Kovacs at me. Yeah, I did consider him, but he wasn't enough of a private eye for me. But I hope you've enjoyed this selection, and please comment on if you've got some more. Bye.